I am not a customer of my government. I just reject this whole idea that everything is a business and everybody has to act like a business.
My name is Ben Charland, and you're listening to What on Earth is Going On. My guest this week is Henry Mintzberg, professor of management, who has been studying and teaching this subject since 1968, all at McGill University in Montreal. Now, Henry is a world-renowned scholar on this subject, as well as looking at the bigger picture. And you can find whole lists of quotes from Henry on the internet, as well as plenty of insight into management, into business, into politics, and into rebalancing society, which is the subject, more than anything, of today's conversation. We talk about the third sector, or the plural sector, that which also goes with the public and the private, the concept of a civil society that fits within that, populism, economics, and the reign of economics over other academic disciplines, Trump and U.S. politics, globalization, Roosevelt's New Deal, and climate change, as well as the other pressures that are facing us today, and the need to find a way to rebalance the way that we do things and to rejig our systems of government and of dealing with one another, maybe also of business. Now, I hope you enjoy this conversation, and if you do, please give it a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts or whatever podcast provider that you use. Also, please go to the website, whatonearthisgoingon.ca. There you can find all previous episodes, as well as a way to get in touch with me. Let me know what you think of this episode or any other by email or on social media. I really do look forward to hearing from you. All right, Henry Mintzberg, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
I'm really excited to chat with you. I'm quite an avid reader of your work, and I'm really appreciative of the things that you have to say, not just in your books, but also on your blog. And you do something called twogging on Twitter, which is kind of blogging by tweet, which is really interesting. But could you explain what that is?
Yeah, actually, when I first proposed the idea, they said, "Oh, don't call it twogging." Apparently, for a few months, there was this thing about dogs and people, so I never say twogging. I was trained to only say twog. Tweet to blog.
Right.
So I only tweet, with rare exceptions, I only tweet to bring people to the blog. I just pick sentences out of the blog and tweet them.
Right. It's really fascinating as a way to get your thoughts and ideas out to the general public. It's just another way because you're a prolific communicator on a wide variety of subjects. Obviously, management has been your forte for a long time, but you've started to talk about it in the last 10 years or so, although I'm sure you talked about it before, but in a public way, democracy, and this interesting post-1989 crisis that we seem to be in, this rebalancing. In fact, that's a key word that you use in a lot of your work, that we need to rebalance our society. Yeah. I want to talk about all that stuff, but before we do, I want to give you the first question, which is always the same. So, Henry, what on earth is going on?
Well, the earth itself is under great threat. What's going on is a fundamental imbalance, and I think many or most of the major problems we're facing, like climate change, like wars around the world, like inequality of income, all those things, like proliferation, nuclear weapons, and all. I think a lot of that stems from the fundamental imbalance we face, and the way I say it is how ironic that what's bringing down democracy in America is the same thing that brought down communism in Eastern Europe.
Right.
It's the same phenomenon. It's just that in Eastern Europe, they were out of balance on the side of their public sectors, and many countries in the world are out of balance on the side of their private sectors.
You've actually said that the Berlin Wall is still falling on us today.
Yeah.
That's a very fascinating thought, that we're still dealing with the consequences of that rebalancing today with the imbalance that we live in right now.
Yeah, because we misinterpreted it. We said communism had triumphed, and communism didn't triumph at all. Balance triumphed. We were much, we meaning the developed so-called liberal democracies, Western European, North American, and so on. We were much more balanced across not two sectors, but three. That's a fundamental point. And ever since the fall of the Berlin Wall, capitalism has triumphed. Balance triumphed, and capitalism didn't triumph, but capitalism has been triumphing ever since.
And that's a really key and quite wonderful idea of yours, that we've been constrained into this binary of private and public. And you've talked a lot about how there's this third domain of the plural that we need to rebalance from. And it's a fascinating thought, because we forget that and we get stuck in this argument between left and right, between public and private, between communism and capitalism. But as you've said, a stool has to have 3 legs. It can't stand on 2. And we neglect the greater purpose of our societies, maybe even our individual lives, if we neglect that area, that civic life. But what could you explain what that is? I mean, you've said that to call it this civic life is not enough, and that plural is a more fitting word. But what does it mean?
Well, the idea has been around forever. The term civil society apparently goes back millennia. And we talk about the not-for-profit sector and the community sector and the social sector and NGOs and not-for-profits, and we've got a whole plethora of labels. So many that nobody sees this as a sector that belongs alongside the other two. And we live in this sector. I define the organizations, and by the way, the word I use is associations rather than organizations, because de Tocqueville, when he wrote Democracy in America in the early 1800s, referred to associations, and he had exactly the same idea in mind, and he said it was key to the new democracy in America. So this isn't a new idea. What I'm trying to do is pick that idea up and have it seen alongside public and private, because the stool can't sit on one leg, whether it's capitalism or communism or pluralism. It can't sit on 2 legs because we get this left-right pendulum politics. You need a third leg. And so I was actually at a conference once where I think they called it a not-for-profit conference or something, or NGO or whatever, and they were using every word and every label in the book. They didn't have even their own labels straight. They must have used 5 different labels in the space of an hour.
Interesting.
And so I said, help me, let's find a word.
Yeah.
And I was calling it the social sector, but then I realized it's not a good term unless you call it the economic sector and the political sector. Then you can say economic, political, social.
Right.
But if you're saying public, private, plural, and somebody piped up and said, how about pluralist? And I said, plural, that's perfect. So public, private, plural, and the associations in this sector are basically those organizations that are owned neither by the state nor by private interests. Okay, by investors. And so we're sitting in Queens. Well, we're not sitting near Queen's University. That's a plural sector organization. It's not owned by the province of Ontario, not owned by anybody. Greenpeace is not owned by anybody.
Yeah.
Médecins Sans Frontières is not owned by anybody. So these are non-owned organizations, or a lot of them are co-op organizations owned by members, but they're not investors. They're owned by members. So Mountain Equipment Co-op in Canada, or REI in the United States. There are more co-op memberships in the United States than people.
Right.
To give you an idea of how big this sector is.
Yeah. More
co-op memberships. There are 350 million co-op memberships in the United States. People have multiple memberships. And the other thing is, we live in this plural. We live in this sector. We might work in the private sector. We might vote in the public sector. We live in the plural sector. Our clubs, our associations, working out at the Y, donating to Greenpeace, Meals on Wheels, volunteering for Meals on Wheels. We live in this sector. This is our social lives.
Yeah, I had one of these conversations with Rachelle Laforêt, who is the director of the MPA program at Queen's University. And one of her focuses is on volunteerism and the organizations to which and for which you can volunteer all around Canada. And what was surprising in the research for that conversation was how many there are. How many associations there are in Canada alone. I think there's over 500,000, if I'm remembering correctly. And that was mind-blowing to me, because it's a sector of society that we forget. Again, partly because we get stuck in this binary, this left-right, political, economic, private-public binary. But also, it seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the plural sector is being elbowed out. is being pressured out of the conversation, that it doesn't seem as legitimate to be an NGO compared to a government body or a massive corporation, for example.
Yeah, like the only real employment is private sector employment.
Right.
That's ridiculous. The social economy, cooperatives are social economy. They're businesses owned by their members, not as investors, but as members. So and it's huge and it's growing, and people are recognizing that. On the other hand, a lot of the sort of, help type NGOs used to be funded by government, but government's getting squeezed more and more. We're living in a scenario that says globalization forces you to reduce taxes, you reduce services, you increase taxes, you increase regressive taxes, like sales taxes, and people vote Brexit and Trump. And so part of that is that the plural sector organizations get squeezed, and they can't get money from government the way they used to. So they're they don't want to be beholden to business, so they're squeezed. One comment about volunteering. One thing you didn't mention are hospitals.
Right.
Think of all the volunteers in hospitals. And Quebec, we had a minister previously who didn't recognize the plural sector, and he in effect nationalized all the hospitals in Quebec. He got rid of the boards and appointed all the executive directors of the hospitals. He had no legal right to do that, but nobody had the guts to challenge him. But somebody said, who would volunteer for a state-owned hospital? Who would volunteer for a privately owned hospital? We volunteer for plural-owned hospitals. We volunteer for community hospitals, which are plural sector.
Interesting. There's another P in here, too, which you touched on with Brexit and Donald Trump, which is populism. And is it possible, then, that because the plural sector is being elbowed out, people see as a replacement for it, for that, that hole in their hearts, if you will, populism, as an easy way back into creating community or a national sense of identity, or
Well, that's what it should be. It should be the revision of balance, in a sense, or the recognition of this plural sector. I don't think that's why people are voting that way. I think they're voting for thugs who are because populism is a plural sector movement,
right?
Community based. Let's take a
grassroots, for example.
Yeah, like Nazism. Okay, Nazism in Germany was community-based. The plural sector is not all wonderful. The National Rifle Association is plural sector.
Bottom up, yeah.
Yeah, it's rooted in communities. But unfortunately, the people they're putting in power, Lula in Brazil was a populist, but he was a balanced populist. He didn't take the country that way, the way what's his name in Venezuela.
Maduro or Chavez.
Well, both. Yeah. I mean, they just took advantage of that kind of populism. I maintain that each sector has its fatal flaw. The public sector's fatal flaw is crudeness. Governments are crude. They've got to treat everybody alike, and governments can be very crude in their rules and regulations. And
reductive, too. If in Canada we have 35 million people, how do we have a law apply to all of them when they're so different?
Exactly.
Regionally, individually, monetarily,
And so people get caught up in these laws. The private sector is crude. Okay, at the limit, not the whole one. I don't mean the whole sector. A lot of it is wonderful, but at the limit, it's crude. I mean, our banks. I'm dealing with phone companies right now. Oh, it's just utterly. I tried to cancel a Rogers phone line, and they sent me to 3 different people. This is a normal transaction. I would like to cancel my phone. She takes all the information, and then she says I have to transfer you to someone else. The someone else is asking me 2 questions, like, do I want to keep the number? Do I want to give it to someone else? Okay?
Yeah.
Fine. I answer the question. She says, now I have to transfer you to a 3rd person who will do it, at which point I blew my top. It didn't help because she had to do it. Why are they doing this? You know why they're doing this? Because they figure I'll give up. That's why they're doing it.
Right.
Because they think, well, he's casually trying to go from Rogers to Bell. Not that Bell's any better. So So it's unbelievable how crude they can be. The plural sector at the limit is closed. It seals itself off. Okay, so Nazism, if you're not part of the club, you're excluded.
Oh, like it's us and them.
It's us and them,
Right.
exactly. So each sector has its own. That's why balance doesn't mean going to the plural sector. Balance means raising the profile of the plural sector so it takes its place alongside the other two. And business has to stop co-opting government. The U.S. Supreme Court legalized bribery. That's what they did when they opened the Citizens United decision. They opened the door to political donations. They legalized bribery. That's what they did. And so governments are totally under the control. I mean, totally. In the U.S., it certainly is. When you look at how people are voting, or Republicans particularly, how they're voting in Congress, they're beholden to business. The National Rifle Association, the sugar interests, whatever it is.
Well, it's going back to this idea of the stool, right? Like rebalancing, like they should all be the same length and sturdiness, so that the stool is actually flat. I
like the idea of a dynamic balance that on average over time it's that, but sometimes goes one way, sometimes goes another. But over time it restores that kind of balance.
A lot of what we're talking about is based on what has changed, like you said. You know, the 1989 fall of the Berlin Wall was a restoration of balance, or a victory of balance.
Well, it was it wasn't a restoration. It was meant to be. It was a victory of balance because the West was much more balanced.
Right.
And many countries retain it. Actually, few countries retain it, but some do. The Scandinavian countries, Canada, New Zealand, maintain that balance. But the idea was that balance in the West triumphed over imbalance in the East. They collapsed under their own dead weight. And
what's so interesting about your argument there is that it goes right in the face of the story we seem to have received, which is Francis Fukuyama's The End of History, right? So the 1989, the Berlin Wall falls, and, it looks like capitalism has won. It looks like this system has won over the other system, and now we can pull back. And of course, now we can retreat government from daily life, and we can treat it as suspect, which is something that you've talked about before. And it's interesting because I wonder what has happened in the last 30, 40 years to cause the kind of flux that we seem to be in at the moment. I mean, you've touched on it a little bit already, but what are the forces and the changes that have shaped our history over that time since the Berlin Wall fell? And therefore, what are we facing when we try to reshape and rebalance the society today?
I can't resist to say a word about Fukuyama. That has to be the single most arrogant book that's ever been written. Monumentally arrogant. Not only because capitalism is so wonderful, which was stupid in its own right, not that capitalism doesn't have its advantages, but this kind of praising of it. But what made it so monumentally stupid was the idea that we had reached perfection. Mm-hmm. That mankind or humankind has reached perfection, and now it's just a question of smoothing into the future, gliding into the future with this wonderful capitalism. I thought the guy was an idiot. So when people come to me, somebody came to me, when somebody's that wrong, and he didn't quite apologize, but he kind of reversed. When somebody came to me recently and said, have you seen his new book? It's actually quite interesting. I said, you know what? I will not read anything that imbecile writes. Because he didn't cause the damage, but he was a main contributor to it. And the arrogance of it is just so monumental, I can't get over it. So let me get over it. What's happened since 1989? It was part of this arrogance, part of this belief that business is everything and business solves every problem. Mm-hmm. Everybody's got to be a business. You got to run hospitals like businesses. You got to run government like businesses. I did an article in Harvard Business Review in the late 90s called Managing Government, Governing Management, where I said, I am not a customer of my government. I just reject this whole idea that everything is a business and everybody has to act like a business. Healthcare is a calling. It's not a business. There's a Harvard professor who referred to hospitals as focused factories.
Right.
All this is really...
Well, and one euphemism that troubles me is this idea that I'm not a citizen, I'm a taxpayer.
Yeah.
And the only reason I have a right to speak out or say anything is because I pay taxes. Not because I live here, I'm a citizen, I'm a member of this plural society, but simply because I paid my way. Because if that's true, then surely someone who pays more has more right to speak than I do. You actually framed this really interestingly, what you're talking about now. The dominant paradigm of our time seems to be, or the business paradigm seems to be, that greed is good, markets are sufficient, property is sacred, and governments are suspect.
Yeah. I mean, that's the nonsense that economics has dumped on us. I just posted a blog this week called Not Noble, spelled Noble.
About the Nobel Prize.
Yeah. Not Noble, and the other title is the fake fact of economics. The fake fact of economics is that there's a Nobel Prize in economics. There's no Nobel Prize in economics. They created a prize at the Bank of Sweden for themselves. The economists created this prize, and then they added in memory of Alfred Nobel, and then suddenly everybody calls it a Nobel Prize. It's not a Nobel Prize. I speak to educated, interesting people, and I say, do you think there's a Nobel Prize in economics? And they say, of course.
Of course.
Well, check his will. Go on to nobelprize.org, where, of course, they list the prize, and then chickens, gutless, for some reason they're scared of the economists, they stick this statement way in. You'll never find it unless you search for it by that name, not a Nobel Prize. That's way into the site. Not a Nobel Prize. Of course it's not a Nobel Prize. And with this memorial thing, so now they're maneuvering to have it called the Nobel Memorial Prize, as if everybody will assume it's a Nobel Prize anyway.
Right.
It's just a ploy. It's incredible what people get away with. It's a ploy to make people think it's a Nobel Prize. It's a Bank of Sweden prize.
And perhaps because of that, economics as a profession, as a part of academia, has soared in terms of how much it's referenced. So I saw an article in The Economist over the last year or two, which essentially shows what academic faculties are referenced compared to others. So in the 1970s, anthropology, sociology, political science were all highly referenced. But over time, economics has become ascendant over all of them. It is the number one referenced discipline in academia over all the others today. And that you can see the line, and I'm assuming that the Nobel Prize, quote unquote, of economics has in part caused that.
Big factor. Can you send me that? I'd love to see that.
Yeah, I mentioned. I will. I mentioned it in another episode, and I don't know if I found it at the time, but I'll look for it again, and it'll be in the show notes for this episode. But I'll send it to you as well. But yeah, it was a graph in The Economist, and it blew me away because it just shows us the paradigm again of our time and how economics has become the sort of backbone. And it kind of creeped up from behind us when that happened.
And it's the narrowest of the social sciences. Or what I'm arguing in the blog I did now is each of the social sciences has its major concept. Okay, so in anthropology it's culture, and in political science it's power, and in economics it's markets, and each of them is interesting. Together they describe the human condition. But can you imagine having a society that only looks upon itself in terms of culture? It would be ridiculous.
Right.
Well, that's the society we have. It only looks upon itself in markets. And it's ridiculous. It's just plain silly.
But it's happening. It seems to me, and this is a conversation I've had with other guests on this podcast, that we are putting everything under that umbrella. Everything kind of fits within the market paradigm.
Yeah, exactly.
Whether it's where you're going for a walk with your dog, or you're going out to eat dinner, or what used to be, say, culture or power or just mathematics, for example, is all fitting within this idea of markets. It's being subsumed under this. And that seems to me a true imbalance.
So do me a favor, and every person who's going to listen to this, please do me a favor. How in the world do I get the point out? I have tried. One day I will publish a book of articles, opinion pieces that were turned down by the New York Times. Okay, how it's so obvious, it's so evident, and I can't get through. I got through to you. I get through to lots of people. I can't get through to any mainstream situation. I just can't get through.
Something that stuck with me from this conversation so far is Henry's reaction to Francis Fukuyama's End of History, which came out as an essay in 1989 and then as a book a few years later. Now, coming up in this conversation, we talk about something that's close to that, of course, that is Donald Trump and U.S. politics. We don't go too much into the nitty-gritty of it, but we do talk about it in the context of rebalancing society. All that's coming up on this episode of What on Earth is Going On. Could I ask, though, do you think that in the mass chaos of social media and the internet today, can anyone get through?
Get through with anything.
I mean, Donald Trump, for example, not to bring in the guy that sucks the oxygen out of every conversation, but that's what I'm going to do. He seems to be able to get through. He seems to be able to tweet out to his millions and millions of followers and get his message across. Because of the people, I think, who disagree with him so much, they help him get his message across.
That's a good point.
They amplify the megaphone because we disagree with him. Oh, have you seen what he said today? Well, that means more and more people hear what he said. But I think most people struggle to get through because there is so much noise. Yeah. You know, the idea of the sound and the noise. Well, finding the sound amidst the noise is really difficult because there's just so much to pick through. And I think most people are exhausted by it and would rather just give up. And
so let me a number of things about that. A lot of this has happened once he became president because he's got the bully pulpit, and that's working very nicely for him. So the word in my head, in my vocabulary today, as I kind of push with where do we take this, is reformation. Okay, because I think what we're facing is either revolution or annihilation. Okay, revolution in the sense that people are just getting angrier and angrier, and it's not going to lead to good, or annihilation through global warming or through
nuclear weapons,
wars or whatever. Yeah. So I'm sort of intrigued by this idea of reformation, which I'm kind of defining as massive shift in social behavior without much violence, really essentially non-violent. So we had the Reformation. Somebody tacked 95 theses on the door of a church, Luther, and it led to the Reformation. The civil rights movement in the United States, a woman got on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. It led to the civil rights movement. Du Plessis died in Quebec, and it led to the Quiet Reformation. People call it the Quiet Revolution, but it was the Quiet Reformation. The women of Quebec just shifted behavior. Before there was leadership or anything, they just said, I'm not putting up with priests who come to my house when I've just given birth to a baby 3 months ago and ask me if I'm pregnant again. I'm not going to tolerate that anymore. So these things do happen.
Well, and you could even argue that some revolutions are predated by reformations, like the American Revolution, so to speak, was predated by a paradigm shift for Americans who started to identify as such, rather than British subjects, but something different. Yeah. And then it required a war to I guess settle the Reformation, but in a way that took decades, not just a few years of war.
Yeah, although I do call that a revolution because it was violent based. Yeah. Whereas these other ones are more of a model of what because if we got, if 40% of the U.S. population is pro-Trump, and let's say they impeach him and remove him from office, guess who's got the assault rifles?
Yeah.
Guess who's got the assault rifles? Very, very, very dangerous.
Yeah.
So it could, we better do something, and the something we need to do is not against the people. It's not the people who voted for Trump that we've got to turn around. Okay? I say, who are the real deplorables? It's not just the people who voted for Trump, or not especially. It's the people who drove them to vote for Trump. And that's everybody I know, including myself, because we live a life. I'll give you an idea, okay? You work at McDonald's. I don't know what they're getting at McDonald's in the States now, maybe $10, $11 an hour. It's hard to live that way. In Denmark, which is one of the more balanced countries in the world, you get paid $25 an hour to work at McDonald's. You can live a middle-class life working at McDonald's. Yeah. And guess how much a Big Mac costs more in Copenhagen than in New York City?
I don't know.
$1. That's a small price to pay for democracy.
Yeah.
Okay? So what we're doing is squeezing people, and they're angry. It's the deplorables who are doing the squeezing, and those are all the people who are forcing taxes down and so on and so forth in this mistaken idea that somehow it's all about Somehow it's all about getting lower and lower taxes.
I think. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
I never got back to your other question about what happened since 1989.
Yeah, of course. That's like 20 minutes ago, but yeah.
Well, globalization happened in the sense that it was given free rein after the idea that capitalism triumphed. And so there was this race to the bottom with taxing and so on. I call it the globalization scenario. You cut taxes, you force taxes down because every other country is doing it. The governments get squeezed. They cut services. They raise regressive taxes like tax on diesel fuel in France. Okay, guess what? That was the straw that broke the camel's back in France. It was a regressive tax. It was a tax on diesel fuel. And so the people living in the chateaus had no trouble with the tax on diesel fuel, for their Mercedes. But truck drivers had a lot of problem with the tax on diesel fuel. And so they vote Brexit, they vote Le Pen, they vote Trump. We got to wake up. It's so obvious to me, and I'm so frustrated trying to make the point.
Is there another aspect to this too, which is related? And a lot of people have written about why Trump, why Brexit, why did this happen, right? And trying to explain it. And one of the explanations that holds some weight and water with me is this notion that, and it's going along with everything you've said, but it's framed as such that the world in which we live in Western liberal democracies has become that of managerial capitalism, where there is really no more choices to be made. It's like Francis Fukuyama's End of History. We're pretending as if that is true. And so when I go to the ballot box, I don't really have any choices here. My choices are a slight change in tax and a slight change in the healthcare policy and a slight change in education, but really it's within a very narrow parameter. And so instead of feeling like we're making big choices or we're moving forward in a common goal, it's managerial. And to many people, especially those who didn't go to college or university, that's just frankly uninteresting and not captivating. And to just put a plain word on it, it's boring and it doesn't engage people. And so therefore, people turn to something that is engaging, like a reality show president, like a massive, chaotic, disruptive departure from the European Union. And I think a lot of people would feel, I don't care how much chaos this causes. I don't care if the economy is in tatters. And I know this is sounding simplistic, but I want excitement. I want change. I want to burn the thing down. I think that there's something there to me. I'm not sure if you'd agree.
I'd agree. I'd agree completely. I think, I have a collection of what I call adjectival capitalism expressions.
Adjectival?
Adjectival capitalism.
Okay.
I have about 10 labels for fixing capitalism, like caring capitalism and conscious capitalism and progressive capitalism, and it goes on and on. Methinks the capitalist doth propose too much. They're just proposing one thing after another. My favorite is democratic capitalism.
Right.
You know why? Because capitalism is the noun and democracy is the adjective. Like it's capitalism that matters, and by the way, it's democratic. Okay? But let me get into another issue. We'll get back to the management issue because having written about management all my life, I agree with what you're saying. But let me get back to the. I discovered a Reformation that didn't look like the others because it looked like it came from the top. Okay, and that was the New Deal. Franklin Delano
Roosevelt New Deal, yeah.
That was a reformation. That was a huge shift in human behavior in the United States. Now, my research assistant kind of looking at that, she said, if you look at it carefully, it really was a grassroots movement as it started. Roosevelt simply consolidated it and acted on its behalf. Now, Roosevelt also got the Democratic election, got the Democratic nomination, and was able to enact it. I mean, it's possible, if we're talking about elections today, it's possible that Warren could be doing a thing like that.
Right. Elizabeth Warren.
Yeah. I mean, because you say it's more of the same, because Saunders is not going to get Saunders not going to get elected, but Warren could be. Singh wasn't going to get elected in Canada because they're always viewed as a marginal party. So we always choose between central liberals or right-wing conservatives. now maybe with the NDP, the Social Democratic Party, in combined with the Liberals, we might get that kind of shift. Because Trudeau, I think, needs another way to work things through. So if this message got through, it got through to Roosevelt, but it got through to Roosevelt because the country was in such chaos caused by the same kind of imbalance, that kind of imbalance of the 1920s, and Roosevelt was able to turn that around. So, we could get Reformation when people kind of wake up to what the factors are.
Do you think that 2019 is a suitable echo from, say, 1933 or 1929, the era of the Depression and the New Deal, the pre-war period? And the reason I ask that is because, you're talking about this top-down massive decision that was created with the New Deal. Do you think that the answer to this rebalancing today can be found in the political realm, or is it elsewhere?
The answer will come from all three sectors, but the initiation will come from the plural sector. In other words, it'll come from a groundswell of public sentiment. And that's what drove Roosevelt. There was a groundswell that preceded it of public sentiment that said, do something. Okay? Roosevelt said something very interesting later on to a black guy who said, we need certain help for certain things. And Roosevelt said, I agree with you completely. Go out and make me do it. Beautiful. Yeah. In other words, it's the plural sector. It's the plural sector driving the public sector to do something, and it's the plural sector driving the private sector as well to do something. So it's got to happen in all the sectors. It's going to start with a groundswell of people in the plural sector. Now we're all in the plural sector, so you could be a chief executive of a company and still act as a citizen in the plural sector. You could be working for the government and still, we're all part of the plural sector. So that kind of action, okay? But protests aren't going to do it by themselves. It's targeted protests. It's not setting up a tent on Wall Street. So what? Yeah. It's going after some egregious behavior behind one of the closed doors of Wall Street that says, you know what? You're not going to get away with this crap about sugar being a perfectly fine thing to eat, and more the lobbying like tobacco and everything else. Sugar is killing our children and killing our adults. And so we're going to start with sugar, and we're going to make sure that changes, and we'll go one after the other and bring these things down.
Well, and there's an issue hanging and kind of crystallizing this whole conversation, which is climate change. And the reason for me that I say that is because it's the one thing where we have to ask, can we solve this problem through the same mechanisms that have caused it? And when you talk about rebalancing, I guess the question that a lot of people have is it enough? Part of the reason that we're so frustrated with climate change, that action never seems to be taken, or when it does and people get together in Paris or Copenhagen, it's a lot of talk and everyone nods their heads, but nothing really changes.
No.
The private sector continues to do what they're doing. The public sector seems to be beholden to them. And the plural sector, if we're talking about that, seems to either not exist or be banging its head against the wall. And part of the frustration to me is because we're living within this market-dominated umbrella in which that caused the problem, and therefore is it impossible to solve it through that. And my question, therefore, is can we even do this? And I don't mean to put such a dark point on it, but I think it animates a lot of the conversation and a lot of the way that we behave as human beings today in 2019. Is this crisis even solvable? Because if it's not, then just screw it, because I'd rather just watch TV and go for a swim.
Well, you might go for a swim in your own basement.
True, yes.
That's the problem.
Yeah, right.
I isn't it awful that the ice caps are melting? Well, yeah, I kind of read about it in the newspaper. The ice caps are melting where I live. I'm up on a hill, so I'm not worried about, storms. We had a storm in Montreal, the ice storm. But, yeah, as these things happen, people will wake up. But there are two broad solutions that aren't going to work, okay? One is fixing capitalism, okay, with all these adjectival capitalism solutions. Capitalism needs fixing, no question. We need to get rid of the damn stock markets. They're dysfunctional. Not I don't even think we can fix them. I think we get companies out of them and fund themselves in different ways. But fixing capitalism will not fix broken societies. Okay, any more than fixing communism would have fixed the countries of Eastern Europe. We're not going to fix. We need to fix capitalism. It's not going to solve the problem, however. Co-opted government, the other solution is, well, government's got to come to our rescue. Well, good. Government's got to come to our rescue. But governments are co-opted by private interests. They're co-opted nationally by local businesses, and they're co-opted globally by multinational businesses. So they're not going to solve the problem. It's this groundswell of people who will force our governments and force our corporations to wake up. And then you know what I love this in government. We got a problem to solve. We're going to make a 30-year plan. How can anybody not laugh at that? A 30-year plan. That plan is as good as the next government. Trudeau will make a 20-year plan for climate change. Then the Conservatives come in 4 years, and that's the end of that. What 30-year plans? Give me a break. Do a 2-week plan, please. Tell me what you're doing now. I don't mean 3 weeks. I don't mean next month. I mean this month. Tell me what you're doing now. Yeah. Okay? You want climate change? I'm not saying they're not doing things. I think cap and trade, whatever, is. But do it now. Okay? And we get all this horseshit about 30-year plans to solve the world's problems. We won't be here in 30 years if we go back to watching our televisions and the hell with it.
And going for a swim in our basement.
Yeah. We have to swim in the top floor. Then.
Yeah, right. Henry, we're going to have to end soon, but I wanted to say how refreshing this conversation is to talk to somebody about these issues from this angle and perspective, but from someone who has taught managers in business for his whole life. I mean, that's been a key focus of your career, is to help people lead and to help people manage, especially in the private sector. And I think that there's a really interesting but also pivotal corollary here of your work in business and your work in management and these big issues, which we don't see in the same kettle of fish, but they very much are.
I have to just correct something. My doctoral thesis, I studied 5 chief executives. 3 were in business, 1 was in a hospital, 1 ran a school system. All my research has been across all organizations.
Right.
So I'm not a professor of business. I'm a professor of management. I think management is necessary, but I think it's rooted in engaged management. That's my new book, Bedtime Stories in Management, is getting past this lofty leadership and getting to engaging management. So I don't think management's the problem. I think the way it's so much of it is practiced today with people being so self-centered, and egocentric about their practice of management. It's not management that's the problem. It's what the popular version of management is the problem, which they call leadership.
Well, and that's exactly what you just said, which goes back to this lofty leadership, which is like a 30-year plan versus the 2-week nitty-gritty of getting down and engaging rooted management.
Yeah.
Exactly. Henry, we're going to have to end there, but I wanted to say thank you so much for a wonderful conversation. This has been terrific, and I really wish we had more time.
Oh, I love it. I think this conversation itself might be a good way to sort of convey my messages, because the kind of way you pursued it and everything. Let's do something with this.
Great, yeah. Thank you, Henry.
Okay, wonderful.
To learn more about Henry Mintzberg, go to the website whatonearthisgoingon.ca. There you can find all previous episodes, as well as a way to get in touch with me to let me know what you think of this episode or any other, and of course to tell me what you think we should do for future episodes, what guests we should have on the program, and what you think we should be talking about. Now, your quote of the week is from Henry. It's actually something that I brought up in this conversation. It is what he calls the capitalist credo, and therefore the dominant paradigm of our time. Greed is good, markets are sufficient, property is sacred, and governments are suspect. Is there anything wrong with that statement, or anything right with it? Thanks, as always, to our composer, Andrea Wetstein, for providing this wonderful music, and special thanks for this episode to Aquaterra Restaurant and the Delta Waterfront Hotel in Kingston, Ontario, for giving us the space in which to record. Next episode, we're talking with Barbara Bell about the book Ducks Newburyport by Lucy Ellman. I'll see you then.